yesterday I was practicing this presentation with my 3-month-old son, and after 10 minutes he fell asleep. So I don't hope that's a bad sign. So if you want to grab a coffee at this rather early time, just feel free and bear with me. So in the next hour, I want to talk about this topic, and I'll quickly go through the agenda with you. So first, I'm going to do a really quick intro into logic apps. I guess all of you know about that, so I'll keep that short. After that, I want to explain the challenge or the real-life problem that I was facing, and I want you to understand the situation where I was coming from. So after that, I want to give you a brief solution overview of those solutions that I identified now. After that, we are looking into the Logic Apps custom connectors. And after that, we're going to have a practical session where we actually build a custom connector to see how that actually looks like in real life. After that, we're going to look into local gateways. So those are especially relevant for restricted environments. And after that, we're gonna set up a local gateway in another practical session. And after that, we're gonna have a quick summary and a Q&A if any questions apply. So let me get started with this quick intro into logic apps. So I guess most of you are already familiar with that. So logic apps is a low-code platform for automating workflows without writing a single line of code. So it's very easy to build an automation or a logical flow with this tool. And as on the right hand, you can see there are hundreds of pre-built connectors that you can use to easily set up a connection and like an automation. So there are hundreds of connectors, which is really great and which allows you to be rather quick to set up automation. And another interesting thing is like Logic Apps is very similar to Power Automate, aka Microsoft Flow. There are some differences here and there, but overall, there's quite a strong similarity between those. So now let me explain the challenge or the real life problem that I was facing. So while Logic Apps offer hundreds of connectors to different services, I was unlucky because I wanted to connect to 2 services where there are no connectors. So in my case, this was HubSpot, which is a marketing automation tool, and it was a Jira on-premise installation. So while there is a connector for Jira running in the cloud, there's no connector for a Jira solution running on-premise. So those were the 2 services that I wanted to connect, and like I had very important information in those 2 systems, but I couldn't reach them because I didn't have a connector. And that's when I looked into the different options that I have to get to this. So I just saw the question in the chat, why using Logic Apps and not Power Automate? Well, I guess I'm just used to Logic Apps, so you could also do that in Power Automate. So those custom connectors also work in Power Automate. So you can pick the platform that you actually prefer. So let me come back to the solution overview. There are different options that you can use. So you can wait for Microsoft to provide an official connector, and that would have the big advantage that this will be a professional connector and it is also maintained by Microsoft. So whenever there are changes to the API, that's the problem with Microsoft and not yours. But the big problem with that is that there's a lot of uncertainty when Microsoft will connect certain services and what their priorities are. So that was not really an option for me because I wanted to solve this problem right away and not just wait 6 months until Microsoft provides a connector. The other option that I identified is building your own API sync. So basically setting up a server and calling the API manually. So with this solution, you have full flexibility and you can basically do whatever you want because you're actually writing a program yourself. But the big down point is that this requires, first of all, coding skills, and it's hard to maintain. So for example, if you add a couple of new fields to your service, you might have to adjust the server again. And that's nothing that non-coding capable person could do. So moving closer to Logic Apps or Power Automate, there's this built-in functionality to do HTTP requests. So that's a great option. So you can specify the method, so whether it's a GET or a POST request, you can specify the URL and the body, and then you can just call any API directly from within the Logic app. So what I realized using this is that that's first of all quite tedious if you want to use that in a flow, because you always need to have the API definition on hand. So you need to know what's the path that I'm calling, how is the body supposed to look like. So that's quite painful. And another big down point was that you actually need to parse the responses. So most of the times you'll get back a JSON formatted data array or like JSON formatted data, and you need to parse through the JSON, which is not really user friendly. So at the end, I came up with a custom connectors, or I stumbled upon the custom connectors and I looked into those. And in the end, this turned out to be my choice how to solve the problem. So the great thing about custom connectors is that it's super easy to use. So it just looks like any other connector that you have available in the system. And another great advantage of this is that the responses can be predefined. So the JSON is already parsed and you do not need to do that manually. So those were the two main advantages that come with a custom connector. The only thing that's negative about it, you have to set it up once. But honestly, I think the advantages outweigh this setup by a lot. So let me explain more about these custom connectors and what they are. So those custom connectors is basically a way to build your own connector to connect to a service that you want to connect to. And this whole custom connector is based on Open API specs. So that's like a standard format on how to define APIs. It's also really similar to Swagger that you might have already heard if you're working in the API context. So you can also import existing API definitions into your connector. I actually realized trying that might not always yield the best results out of the gate. So you might need to do some adjustments there. Another really cool feature that those custom connectors offer is the fact that you can export those connectors and reuse them. So as I previously mentioned, you could export them from Logic Apps and use them in Power Automate, or you could export it and provide it to whoever wants to integrate to the service that you already built the connector for. And another important thing is that these custom connectors offer different authentication methods. So they offer basic authentication, so basically username and password. You can access a service by using an API key, and you can also use OAuth 2. And I think those three different authentication methods will cover a wide array of services, but there might be services that are not covered by this. So that being said, for the Logic App custom connectors, now I want to jump into a practical session where we are going to build our own custom connector. And if you remember the problem that I stated in the beginning, I wanted to connect HubSpot, which is a marketing automation tool, to our CRM. And I was planning to do that with a Logic app. So as there is no connector available on the market, I decided to build my own custom connector. And this custom connector will, on the one hand, pull data from HubSpot. So in HubSpot, you basically have contacts or prospective customers. So if you go to a website and you enter your email address and you get emails afterwards, this could be HubSpot. And I wanted to pull this information out from HubSpot and push it into our CRM. And I want to show to you how that can be done in a quick practical session. So for that, I'll quickly show you how HubSpot looks like. So we're going to work on a contact level. So right now you see I have two entries in here. I have Maria Halligan and I have Brian Halligan and I have Maria Johnson. And let's assume this is the information that I want to transfer into my CRM. So a great starting point for this is the API documentation that the service or that the provider provides. And in this case, I just pulled up the API docs for HubSpot. And I went to contacts because this is actually the entity that I want to focus on in the session. And if you click here, you'll get the endpoints for this different APIs or for this API. And we can see that here the first method that they offer is a list of records. So basically getting all the contacts that we have in the system. And that's something that I want to do with a custom connector right now. So for that, I'm switching to my Azure portal. And if I hit add, I'll quickly do the shortcut here. You will be able to search for Logic Apps custom connector. So just click on that and we'll give it a name. So let's call it HubSpot 2702. So 2702. All right, and we'll create this custom connector. And while this is being provisioned, I can quickly tell you a bit about the setup of a custom connector. So you have basically three major steps which you have to do before you can use this. So first of all, you have the general information, so which is the name of the connector, image or logo for the connector, and the host and the base path of your API. The second step is the security, where you define the authentication method. And the third part is the definition, where you define your endpoints. So let's get started with the general setup. So I will just upload an icon so it looks nice and fancy. We'll just add a host in here. So the host is defined in here. So if we look at the API specification, we'll see that api.hubapi.com is the host of this API. So we'll just paste that in here. And if we now look into the base path, this is the CRM v3. So a lot of APIs offer different versions over the life cycle of the API. So that's why you'll often have a base URL that you need to consider. So going to the next step into the authentication, I can tell you that HubSpot is offering API key for the authentication. And looking at the API specification, we will see that the API key, in this case, it's called API key, will be provided in the query itself. So let's quickly add that in here. So the parameter name is API. The label is, I'll just name it API key. And the parameter location is within the query. And now we can go into the definitions. So in the definitions, you can define the endpoints. And in this session, I will focus on the actions. So basically the steps that you actively call to get or send information. So we'll just add a new action and we'll give it a summary. And let's say list records. So the summary is basically the user-friendly name that you'll see. The operation ID is the internal ID. So I'll just name that list contact. Down here, you have the visibility of this action. So whenever you are opening up a connector, you can define if they will show up every time, if they show up if you click on show more, or if they are internal. So internal would be the case if you're not using that, if you don't want to use it, make it available for everyone. So I'll add the visibility important so that it's always shown if you select this connector. So after doing this general setup, there are 2 more steps to go. So the one step is to define how your request looks like. And in this case, we're just switching back to the API documentation. And we'll see that this is the path that we are calling. So objects/contacts in order to get all the contacts from HubSpot. So if you want to define a request, hit import from sample. And in this case, it is a GET request. So I'll select this and I'll provide the URL that's being called. So I can now import that and I will see that the custom connector will already identify query parameters. So in this case, there's one query parameter which can limit the amount of contacts that you want to request. So if you hit on that, you can add more details on this, and you could also define if this parameter is required. So in this case, I want to keep it optional. So I'll just go back and continue with defining my response. So we defined how the request should look like. Now we need to define how the response will look like. So the response that we'll get from the API is also in this API definition. So very often you'll find that in the API documentation. If you don't find it in the API documentation, just do a quick call of the API and use this information as a basis. So similar to the request, you can just click here on import from sample, and then I can paste the body in here and import that. So I see here the different parameters are already recognized. Here you also have the chance to do some adjustments. So you can add a more user-friendly name to it. So I'll do that for first name and last name. So I'll just add a different title. So the title is the thing that the user will be shown. The description is more or less the internal information. So let me quickly finish that. So if I go back now, we have built our first endpoint. So we added general information, we defined the request, and we defined the response. And that's basically all that we need to do to build our first endpoint. So I just hit update connector to save that. And now we can give it a try if this connector works. So for that, I will create a logic app that will use this custom connector, and you'll see how the response will look like. So I'm going to create a quick logic app. Let's call it test HubSpot. And we'll see how this custom connector looks like in action. So let me quickly jump to the resource here. So I'll just add a new step. So this should be familiar if you're working with Power Automate or also if you're working with logic apps. So in here, I can just search for HubSpot and I will see my connector, HubSpot 2702. So that's the one that we just created. And I see we have built one connection, which is list contact. So if I select this, I need to do my connection. So that's similar to pretty much all other services as well. I need to enter a connection name. So there we go. So I'll call it HubSpot 2702 as well. And I need to provide an API key. So in this case, I'll just take the one that I already got from HubSpot. I hit create. And then I can see that I can add parameters, but I don't have to. So let me just run that without any parameters. And what I would expect is a list of all the contacts that we have in HubSpot. So let's see. I can see that the connector was running successfully. And if I open this step, I will see that we'll have Maria Johnson and Brian Halligan in here. So I already retrieved data from a service that was not previously available in Logic Apps. So now let's see how the response can be used. So as I told you, one big advantage of those custom connectors is the fact that the responses will be already parsed. So that means if I go into my selection menu, I can directly select the email that was given back from the HubSpot API. So I'll just add that in here. And because these are multiple contacts, it's going to do a for each loop. So if I hit run, we will see a loop that goes through those two contacts and give me the email address. So in this case, I have email Maria, and the second one is bh@hubspot.com. So this has been the first endpoint, which is basically pulling data from HubSpot. Another example that I want to do is pushing information into HubSpot. So that should be the proof that you both can receive and also send information to the service via custom connector. And for that, we are going to use this create statement that we'll find in the HubSpot API documentation. So I'm switching back to my custom connector and I'm adding a new action. I'll call it create contact. I'll give it an operation ID, create contact, and I'll make it important as well, so we see it directly. So the setup is exactly the same. In this case, I need to set up the request. So I'll just hit import from sample. Then I'll say this time it's a post statement because we want to create a record, and we'll need to provide the path for that. So in this case, it's this one. Let me add the HTTPS as well, but that shouldn't be an issue. So we have what kind of request this is. We have the path of the request, and now we also need to provide the body of the request. So in this case, we'll see that the data that we need to provide is in here. And that's what I want to give as a body. So let me adjust that real quick. I need to delete what's on top here. So I added the body in here. I can import that, and I will see that this body shows up in here. So I can edit the details of that. And if I go in here, I will see that I can define whether this body is required. So as I want to create a contact, I need to provide any kind of information. So I make that required. And what do you need for a contact? Let's say at least you need an email address. So let's make this required as well. Let's say we need a first name and we need a last name. So I'll make those 3 parameters required. So that means that they always need to be filled out. One more thing that I'm going to do is switch the visibility. So by default, you can add those parameters by clicking on this drop-down list, but I want those parameters to always show up because they are in fact very important, and without those you cannot operate. So there we go. So with this, I have defined my request, and now I need to define my response. So for that, I go to import from sample again, grab the response that I get from the API documentation, paste it in here, import it, then we'll see the same body. So now you can do some cosmetic changes, formatting here, but I'm going to skip that. So now we have our second endpoint. We have the general information, we have the request, and we have the response. So I hit update connector, and now we'll test whether we can create a new contact. So for that, I add my connector here again. I see we have a second endpoint that says create contact in here. So if I select that, I see the 3 parameters that I made required and that I set to important. So let's provide an email address here and also a first name and a last name. And if you're feeling lucky, you can also add additional information like a website, for example. So let's just add this. And now let's run this. So what that should do is basically create a new contact in HubSpot. So we see that the step was successful. We can see that there was an ID given to this contact. So if I switch to HubSpot right now, the actual system that I want to work in, we should see this test test phase. So that's the record that I just created. So that means that we talked about how to create a custom connector to a system that we do not have previously. And I showed you how you can pull information and how you can push information into the system. So that solved pretty much the first problem that I was facing. But actually, looking at the original problem statement, I had another problem, which was connecting my on-premise system. So in my case, I wanted to connect to an on-premise installation of Jira. So this on-premise installation is only available through VPN or in our internal network. So that is not possible by using a standard custom connector. Reason for that is because it's not publicly available on the internet. So there is a solution that Microsoft has to offer for this use case, and this solution is a local gateway. And I want to show you how you can make that work for you in the next practical session, where we'll look how you can set up a local gateway. So in this test setup, I'm going to connect to Redmine. Redmine is an alternative to Jira. So because in like the real system that I was integrating, there's a lot of valuable data and I can't just show it to you. So I just spun up a VM with Redmine running on it. So Redmine is just an open source alternative ticketing system. And I'm going to install the local gateway on another virtual machine that I am running on my local PC here. And with this local gateway, we'll be able to connect to a custom connector and use that in the Azure Logic apps. So for that, I want to quickly jump back into the browser. And I really quickly want to show you Redmine. So it's a, as I said, open source ticketing tool. And I just created a couple of requests. So I have a test bug in here. So I just added some sample data to see if I can connect to the service. So as you can see in the address bar, this is running on my local machine. So I wouldn't be able to call that from anywhere outside of my network. The API response that you'll get is rather easy. So it's just the host address and then issues.json. And that's what the JSON response looks like. So that's basically the data that I want to get from my local PC into the cloud, into Logic apps. So for that, I need to install a local gateway, and I'll just move over my virtual machine in here. So I just, if you just Google for data gateway logic app, you'll end up on this Microsoft site, and you can install a gateway connector in here. And after installing the gateway connector, after downloading the gateway connector, you can start with the installation. So we'll quickly do that. So I'll accept the terms and services and install this connector. So let's just agree to that. So that's the very first step if you want to connect your on-premise service with a Logic app. So it's installing the on-premise data gateway within the network that you're trying to connect. So let's quickly change over here. So right now we are doing this, installing this local gateway. So after installing this local gateway, we are doing the next step, which is configure the on-prem data gateway in your VM. So that basically means that we are connecting it to our Azure account. And after we connected it to our Azure account, we can create an on-premise data gateway in Azure itself. And after that, we can build the connector for that. So let me switch back to my virtual machine. So installation is still running. So let's give it a couple of seconds until that finishes. So this on-premise gateway was actually super helpful to access the data from our local installation of Jira. And we are actually using that on a daily basis. So especially if you have important data on a local system, that's a big help. So we now need to connect to our Azure environment. So let me quickly pull up my email address that I want to connect to. So it's this one. All right. So I need to provide an email address. And now I will be prompted to log in into my Microsoft account. So let me quickly do that. So that always takes a couple of seconds, but keep in mind that's all running on my local PC here. So I have the two virtual machines running. The one is running Redmine and the other one is running the gateway. So let's give it a second. So let me just look into the questions. How can we diagnose connector communication to the backend? View raw requests and response. So in Logic App Diagnostics, we can only see what has been sent to the connector and what connector returned. That is actually a quite good question. Honestly, I didn't come to the point where I had to diagnose that. So I have to admit I don't have an answer for that. So let me quickly do this authentication in here. So, I'm not quite sure what options you have to diagnose this. So I can take that with me and maybe provide a feedback afterwards. And do you have any recommendations for managing response status codes? No. So I don't have a recommendation for managing those status codes. It makes a lot of sense to stick to what the API provides, but I don't have any detailed recommendations here. So let me quickly get back to the setup. So I want to register a new gateway on this PC. And for that, I need to give a name. So I'll call it Redmine 2702. And I'll add a recovery code. And then we can do the configuration. So this will now set up this on-premise gateway in a way that it can be connected to a Logic app. Something that you need to be careful about is the region setup. So you have to make sure that this gateway is set up in the right region. So now we do see that this on-premise data gateway is correctly set up. The gateway 2702 is online and ready to use. So that's great. So I'll pull aside my VM and go back to Azure itself. So what we did is basically install the gateway and configure the on-premise gateway. And now we need to create the cloud counterpart of that. And this can be done also rather quickly. So you'll just search for on-premises data gateway. And I'll just enter a name. I'll call it Redmine 2702 as well. And I need to select the installation name. So you can see I had a couple of installations before, but the one that we want to use is Redmine 2702. So I'll just select that and create this gateway. So after that, we have set up the cloud environment as well. And now we can add our custom connector for Redmine. So I'll just create another connector here and call it Redmine on-prem, because that's what makes it special. All right. So in this case, we have a similar setup to the HubSpot connector. So we'll have the general setup, and for an on-premise connector, we need a bit of a different setup. So let me quickly upload an image here. So I want to connect via on-premise data gateway. So I just need to mark that. So that's like the most obvious case. Right now, this is running on a virtual machine. I didn't take care about HTTPS. So this service is running on HTTP. So I need to switch that over as well. So then I need to provide the host information. And as we said, this is running locally. So as we're using this custom connector, I can provide the host in the local format, which looks like this. And in this case, we do not have a base URL. So moving to the security, the authentication of Redmine is going to be basic. So you need to provide user and password. And that's basically it for the security setup. Now I can define the actions. So the actions that I want to define is get tickets, and I'll call the operation ID get tickets. Now we need to import the request. So I'll just tell you that this is the request and this is a get. So it's a GET request, and that's the address for it. I can import this, and now I can define the response. I'll just use an example here. So this is the data that I get from Redmine, from the API. So I'll just paste it here as a response. You'll see that those values will be split up. And now I can hit update connector. And that's basically it for the setup of the custom connector. So now we want to test if this custom connector actually works. So we'll create another logic app. And we'll call it test Redmine. And in this test logic app, we'll just request data from the local gateway and see if we can get this information from my service that is running on my local PC. So I'll just add in here, search for Redmine, and I'll see Redmine on-premise. That's the one that we just created. I select that, I use get tickets, and now we have a bit of a bigger connection setup. So I'll need to provide the connection name. I need to provide user and password. So the username is user, password already entered in here. And then I have to select the connection gateway. So that's basically the cloud counterpart that we already created in the step before. So I'll see it's Redmine 2702. I can just select that and create the connection. And now I can save the logic app and run it. And then I hope that we'll see the green mark. And we do see the red mark, the green mark. And we'll see that we have requested information from a system that is running on a local network that would otherwise not be available for any logic apps. So that's basically our practical session on local gateways. And that's basically also pretty much the end of the stuff that I wanted to show you. So in the end, we did two things. We created a custom connector, which allowed us to pull information from a system that has not been previously connected to logic apps or Power Automate. So that is a really big advantage for me because it allowed me to solve my underlying problem, which is getting data from a certain service into my system. So it also offers a great usability, so it's easy to use and the responses are already parsed in a proper way. So that is actually a really nice way to interact with your services. You do not need a long learning curve. It's just like every other connector as well. And the second part we did was setting up an on-premise data gateway that allowed you to connect a service that was running in a restricted environment. So in this case, a local network or a on-prem network. And this local gateway allowed us to have a secure connection into the cloud and also use the information from the local system in the Logic app or in Power Automate. So maybe one more thing that I could show you is basically how you get this out of the Logic app world. So if we go back to our resource group, you have here this icon for the custom connector, and you can just hit download, and this will download the definition of this custom connector. And now you can exchange this definition. So that's actually quite nice. That being said, I am pretty much done with my talk. And right now I will switch over to a quick question session. So I've seen there came in a couple of questions. So let me see, that was the diagnosis, recommendations. Is it possible to use App Insight to monitor the connection to data gateway? To be honest, I haven't tried that out, so I can't really tell you. Sorry about that. Where do you get the recovery key was the other question. So when you were setting up this on-prem data gateway, you could set a recovery key. And that's basically a recovery key that you can define on your own. So the only important thing is that you keep that recovery key somewhere so that in case you want to restore this gateway at some point in time, you'll have it handy. I see a comment on my password policy here. The custom connector in Azure, is it same as the one used in Power Platform? Is it possible to create a custom connector in Azure and use it in the Power Platform and vice versa? So as far as I know, you can use this custom connector also in the Power Platform, so in Power Automate. So that should be possible. Is it possible to just use custom connector to connect to on-premise data? So as far as I know, you always need a local gateway in order to connect to on-premise data. So that's what I think. But I know that the second speaker today will talk about Azure integration services. So I'm a bit unsure if that also gives you a way to connect to on-premise data with a custom connector only. The next question, how do we identify when to use Logic apps and Power Automate? Which would be the cheapest option for customer? So whether you're using Logic apps or Power Automate, that's indeed, for me, a hard question. So I was standing in front of the same question like a year ago, and I just went with Logic apps because that offered a couple of features that were actually quite handy. But honestly, I haven't found the clear strategy when to use Logic apps and when to use Power Automate. So if someone else can give advice, I would be happy for that. You also asked about the cheapest option for the customer. So I know there's going to be a session on Logic app pricing later today. So that might be a great question for this later session. Next question is it possible to create a connector from on-premise WCF service? Honestly, I'm not quite sure what the WCF service is, so maybe you can send that in the chat. I assume you have to create REST wrapper API around first. So a little unsure about that question, Windows Communication Foundation. To be honest, I haven't worked with that, so sorry, I can't give you an answer to that. Yeah, sorry. What is the best practice to connect ESB? Again, that's something that I haven't worked with, so sorry about that. All right. There's another question coming in. Trigger type actions, example, push data from Jira to Logic Apps is the same complexity as create or list type actions. So those trigger actions are actually a bit of a different animal. So I was trying to do one of those trigger actions in the session, but I haven't found an API that allowed me to do that. So there are some reasons why this might be a problem. So I was trying to connect Shopify and first of all, there are different triggers that you can use or trigger mechanisms. The one trigger mechanism is webhook and the other one is a polling system. So I was trying to use a webhook trigger, setting up with a Shopify account. But trying to set this up, Shopify limits the length of the webhook URL. So basically, as Microsoft is creating a rather long URL for this Logic App instance, the address from the webhook or where I would expect the webhook to go to was too long for Shopify. So that was more or less a problem of Shopify, but that led to the fact that I couldn't install this webhook trigger. The other thing that I was trying was using a polling trigger. So basically requesting data in a regular schedule and then checking the difference between those two states. So for that, you also need an API that allows you to do that. So there are some limitations in Logic Apps where you paste those parameters that you're using. So those parameters, I think, must be pasted in the query. So that's what the API that I tested did not provide. So that's why I couldn't connect to a polling trigger in this example. So to sum up your question, trigger type actions are, from my perspective, a lot harder to set up. So the actions are quite easy. The triggers are a bit harder and they don't always work. So that's a bit of an open topic for me. So I've seen that Steve-Jan Wiggers got my back. He will dive into some of those aspects that you asked for in the next session, so like ESB, Azure Integration Services. So let me see, any other questions coming in? Yep. Any limitations of the on-prem gateway that we should be aware of? So honestly, I didn't run into any limitations, but I'm not doing a hell of a lot traffic on this. So I'm just calling this API once a day to update certain information. So I'm not running very large volumes. So I haven't ran into any limitations. So I can just recommend for you to give it a test and try it. So is there any separate configuration on SMTP service settings requiring while sending email on-premise in Logic Apps? So it seems like you want to send emails from an on-premise email server, I guess. That's very specific. I haven't tried that, so can't tell you if there is a separate configuration necessary. Yeah, okay. Bandwidth is a limitation of the on-premise Gator gateway. That might be correct. So, as I said, one I recently came to know is multiple results sets cannot be returned from SQL. So it seems that there are certain limitations on this on-premise data gateways. So yeah, I guess if you're running a different scenario, or if you have a different scale of requests that you're sending, maybe that's not the right solution for you. But for me, it was actually quite helpful. I could request the information that I was needing, so that I needed. So in different cases, you might want to apply a different setup. So let's see what Steve-Jan Weers is going to present to us. So maybe one last word from my side before I hand over. This is my first talk in the Power community, and it would be great if you are willing to provide some feedback to me. So whether you like this or not, I created a quick questionnaire about that. I'll promise you it's just taking you 15 seconds and it's helping me a lot. So if you want to provide feedback, just to go to tiny.cc/logicapp and leave your feedback. That being said, I want to thank